Hey everyone, this is Negar. I am a front-end developer, surprisingly. I'm from Iran, but I work and live in Germany in the beautiful city of Berlin. Today, I'm here to talk about the third piece of Frontend Pie, CSS. A couple of weeks ago, when I was working on the content of my talk, I thought maybe it's a good idea to portray the title of my talk. I actually bake a pie for the first time in my life, because, why not? And since I had literally no experience in baking, I thought maybe it's better that I start with something less complex. So I started with a cookie, and I did. I baked it. As you can see, it looks good, it smelled amazing, and it tastes good too. But if only you soak it 5 to 6 minutes in the tea, otherwise you will lose a tooth. So since the baking project was a success, I thought maybe I shouldn't waste more ingredients on a pie. And instead, I used a recipe that I'm actually good at. I baked a CSS pie. I know it's not really perfect, but it's my very first pie. It's good enough. So, the rest of my talk is going to be mainly about CSS, so the fun part is basically over. If you want to run, then now is the time, just run for your life. So, I'm just joking. As long as I'm speaking, it's not going to be boring. In past few years, we all have seen the front end has been evolving and getting more and more complex. And JavaScript was playing a key role in this change. Nowadays, all the talks are about JavaScript, all the articles, and everyone is talking about JavaScript. And now that all these spotlights are on JavaScript, I think we all need a reminder. If we look at frontend as a pie, JavaScript is just one piece of this pie. And if we are just very good at JavaScript, at the end, we are just a JavaScript developer. But in order to be a good front-end developer, you need to have all the pieces of this pie. One of the pieces that recently, in my opinion, is not receiving enough attention is CSS. CSS is easy, but it's not easy. In order to learn CSS, you don't need to know about data structure and algorithm and all sort of complex stuff. From outside, it's basically learning some properties and putting up together and trying to reach to the outcome which is desired. But when was the last time that you've been asked to make a little tweak in your styling and you ended up rewriting the whole section from scratch? When was the last time that you actually did a code review on CSS code? By that, I don't mean to just check the UI of the application in different screen sizes. I mean actually reading the CSS code line by line and leaving useful comments. Some people say CSS is not predictable. And some people say that CSS, there's no right or wrong for CSS. So as long as the outcome is how it should be, it's okay. So if you are in any of these groups, I think you should watch this talk till the end, because I hope I can change your mind. Now I'm going to show you an example here. Okay, here's an example. Here we have two alert boxes. It's a very oversimplified example. I just want to make my point here. So we've been asked to create an alert box, and it is basically a div, which is the alert itself, and there is a p tag inside with a text, and that's pretty much it. And these two boxes on top and bottom, they're identical, but they have been implemented, like they have a little difference. We get to that. But right now, let's focus on the top one. Here, based on the design, we've been asked to have a spacing between the text and the body of the alert box. So we are adding a margin of 15 pixels to the p tag inside to create this spacing. Well, if I see this in a CSS code, I would definitely leave a comment and ask for a change. You might ask why. Well, imagine like in 2 weeks, you receive a new task to add a button to the same alert box, like an action button. So now let's imagine that you have created the button and you add it to the alert box. Let's just see how it looks. As you can see, the button is off. I mean, it's not centered, it doesn't have this spacing. So now you have to go back and change your alert box to give the proper spacing between the alert box and the button and the text. But if from the very first step, when you were creating the alert box, instead of using the margin, you were using a padding and added to the alert itself, like the one here, the outcome was pretty much the same, but when you were asked to add the same button, you just need to add the button and it works pretty much well. I mean, here, the change is very little. The decision, it looks to be really important here, but in the future, it will save a lot of time from you. For example, if you just look at this example, this spacing actually doesn't belong to the content inside. This spacing belongs to the container, and this alert box should be designed or created the way that whatever content you put inside it has the proper spacing from the parent. So making a right decision when you're writing your CSS code will save time in future. So it does matter what properties you use and how you make the decisions. So how do we know that when we should use which of these properties when the outcome is like exactly the same? How can we predict such problems? Well, these are the concepts that are laid in fundamental concepts of CSS. For example, here, probably box modeling would help you. Like any other languages, CSS has been made of some fundamental concepts. These fundamental concepts are like the building blocks of CSS. In order to learn CSS, you shouldn't memorize like all the list of the properties, but what we should do was to learn these fundamentals, and these fundamentals will categorize the properties for you so that you know how CSS interpret each group of these properties behind the scene. Here, I don't have a list of all of the properties because they're not just, there are more than this that you can see in this slide. And I'm not going to cover all of that because for that, then we need a CSS 101 workshop. But today, I try to just point out in a form of an example, trying to point out to a couple of these fundamental concepts to show you that how useful these are, and we are basically using them like every day, and how ignorant we are about them. So let me show you another example. One of these fundamental concepts that we learn at very first steps of learning CSS is selector. Basically, when you start learning CSS, it's just pick a DOM element, add some styling. So in order to pick that element, you use selectors. But selectors are more than just getting elements by their tag name or class name or IDs. There are so many advanced CSS selectors that you can use and basically implement some logic. I will show you how. Here we have an example of a list of custom checkboxes because the default checkbox is boring, so we've been asked to create a custom checkbox. So here's the checkbox, and then we have this text. Let's just take a look at the HTML here. So here in the HTML, we have a list of rows, and these rows are just basically for separating the checkboxes. We don't need that. We don't need to worry about that at the moment. We have a div, which is the checkbox. And inside this checkbox, we have an input of type checkbox. We have a label, and this input and the label are connected through the ID, which is passed as a for attribute to the label. And then we have this div that contains the text. Connecting input to the label gives us the possibility that when the user clicks on the label, it is exactly that the user is clicking on the checkbox itself, so it toggles the checkbox to on and off. So now we can safely visibly hide the input from user's site and instead create our own custom checkbox with the label. Now, let's just take a look at the code here. Here I have lines of CSS code to create this cute box here for the checkbox. I'm using a selector to give it a subtle hover effect. I'm using after attribute. I'm using after pseudo element to create the check mark itself, which is initially hidden. Its opacity is initially set to 0. But when we click on the checkbox, the opacity goes to 1. So let's see how we're handling that. Here, in this part of the CSS, I am saying get the input element. Whenever the input element is checked, then look for the siblings. Siblings are the other elements that they all share the same parent. So look in the siblings for the label element, and then for the after pseudo element of label, set the opacity to 1. So what we are actually seeing here is logic. We are basically setting a condition saying that in order, if the input state was checked, then set the opacity to 1. We usually use JavaScript for these sort of logics, but you can see that using selectors, you have the power to write logic here inside CSS. Let me show you another example. I wanted these checkboxes to have some sort of a spacing. So I was intended to give margin button to these rows that are wrapping the checkboxes. But I didn't want the last one to have the margin button because then the whole list was a little bit off. I wanted to be perfectly centered. So previously, if I wanted to do the same thing, I would probably get all the rows, add a margin button to it, for example, 25 pixels, and then get the last row and then overwrite the margin button value to 0. But using advanced selectors, what you can do is to say that get the rows except for the last one and set the margin button to 25 pixels. It's like magic. It's in one line, a lot simpler, and in my opinion, it's much prettier. When we're talking about selectors, we have to talk about another concept in CSS, which is very important, and it is specificity. I'm not going to say this word a lot because it's hard for me to pronounce it. What it means is that each of these selectors, they have some sort of a power. They have a different weight. So if you are using a class or an ID, they are different in power and the amount of specificity. So when you are adding selectors together, it's like you're adding up to this power and you are getting more and more specific for adding a style to an element. When you're writing styles, you should always keep an eye on that, because if you just get too specific in order to add some styles to some elements, you are just giving away this power from yourself to override those styles in future. Because at some point you want to create an element and you want to use it in different environments, and maybe based on some environments you want to override some of the properties of this element. So you don't want the styles to be too specific so that it is basically impossible to override. And if you go too specific with your styles, you are destroying the reusability of that piece of code, because you don't have to write a piece of CSS code on and on. You can have a list of CSS code attached to a class and then add a class to different places and have the same style. I think everybody knows that. So if I want to show you an example here, for example, this checkbox in the HTML is a children of row element. But when I was writing the CSS styles, I didn't write the checkbox styling as a children of the row. The reason is I know that this checkbox is not dependent to the row and to its parent. Right now, we are using this checkbox inside the row, but maybe somewhere else in the same application, we want to use this checkbox as a children of a form. So if I just write this checkbox as a children of the row, then I cannot reuse it. So we have to always be careful about the amount of specificity and find the balancing point from being like not really specific to the point that we are like too specific. Now here is another question. That imagine we have two selectors with the same amount of specificity pointing at the same element and trying to set the same property. For example, they are both trying to set the background color. Which one would win? Well, here comes another fundamental concept in CSS, which is, I think everybody knows it, but a lot of what we didn't know that it has a name. It is called cascade. Cascade says if the amount of specificity is the same, the one that comes last overrides the previous ones. So, and let me show you another fundamental concept that we have hidden in this piece of code, and it's inheritance. These texts here, you see that they have the color of white and they have some custom fonts. But if you check the piece of code here, the code that I wrote to style this text, there is no trace of color and font family here. So where are these properties coming from? Well, if you check the body, which is the parent of all, you see that I have set the color and font family here. So it's like these properties are being inherited from the parent, from like the great parent. Some of the properties in CSS can be inherited from parents, and some of them they can't. So it's important to know which one is which. So now we are going to talk about the two of the concepts in CSS that I really love: transition and transform. I use them always together, so I think they're kind of like connected. To me, it's like that. Using transitions and transforms, you can create tiny, subtle animations. So here in this example, we have literally no animation. So when I toggle the checkbox, the check mark just suddenly appears. And I don't think that it's really beautiful. As a front-end developer, you usually receive a static piece of design, but it is your job to give it life using animations and transitions. So we are going to do that on this example here. So in the label, here I am going to set a transform. I'm going to say that this check mark, as we said, that it's going to be initially hidden, like the opacity is going to be 0. I'm going to add to that, and I'm going to say I want this checkbox to be rotated like 90 degrees, and then I want it to scale down to 0. So we don't see it, but here in the input, I have, I think, another line of transition, which is not really, but okay. So here in the input, when we were saying that when the checkbox is checked, now we say when the checkbox is checked, set the opacity to 1, and after that, then transform the check mark to the 0 degree, so from 90 degree to 0 degree, and then scale it from 0 to 1. So it would be like a transition like that. And I don't want these things to happen sudden so user cannot see it. I want it to be over time, over a half a second transition, so we can see the animation. So let me just uncomment all of these transition and transforms and test once again. Ooh. See, it's much cuter and it's more lifelike. So another friendly advice is that please learn how to work with animations. Some people think that animations and CSS are some fancy thing that you're not going to use ever in your job. So they just leave them and say, okay, we'll learn them whenever it's necessary. But I'm going to tell you, they can save your time and energy a lot of times. You as a front-end developer are going to be asked to create some animations, and sometimes if JavaScript is the only tool that you know, you are throwing yourself in a lot of pain. Just you have to use like some third-party libraries, you have to trace the time, write lines of code, and it's going to be buggy and it's not smooth. But if you use animations, CSS animations, to create animations, they are going to be short, they are fast, they are clean, they're less likely to be source of any bugs. So please do that, do that to yourself and go learn animations. I don't have animation example here, but I will show you some of the animation examples as other CodePen examples at the end. So there are, as I said, there are like more than these fundamentals, fundamental concepts in CSS that you can learn. There are like tons of resources out there, but one of the greatest Resources that I really liked is an article by Rachel and Drew on Smashing Magazine. The title is How to Learn CSS. I really recommend you to take a look at this article. It has great headlines and you can search each headline. It can be like a day of studying. It's a great resource. So now let's imagine that we have mastered all the fundamentals of CSS. Then it comes the properties, and properties, there are like tons of them. How can we learn more properties over time? So I used to have, and I still have, 2 methods to learn CSS properties, and I'm going to teach you how these 2 work. The first one is to use browser inspect element. I'll tell you how. We are using internet and websites every day, no matter you're at work or you're on holiday. Whatever we're doing, we search online and we visit different websites developed by different developers around the world, from large teams to small teams. So as a front-end developer, you should have a critical mind whenever you see something interesting implemented in a website. Immediately check the browser inspect tool and see how the CSS code is written. And you can just toggle the properties, change the values, see how it affects on the design. And oh my God, you don't know how much it can help you. I mean, it not only helps you to learn about new properties, but it gives you a lot of implementation ideas. Because it happened to me that I saw that there is a property there that in my opinion it's not necessary. So then I tried to remove it and I saw that some problem happened in the design. And later in my job, whenever I face the same problem, I know what property can help me to fix that. So it doesn't take you a lot of time, like taking a course. It's just a daily practice, maybe 5 minutes a day, but over time, it has great impact. Another method that I use is CSS illustration. And I know, you're probably mad at me and you're like throwing your shoes and pillows at the screen, shouting like it's not going to be ever used in a real life application. And I do agree with you. I know we have SVGs and you will never use CSS illustration in a real life applications. But this is not the point. I'll tell you what is the point. And by the way, you don't have to start with the very complicated illustrations. I know that there are great people out there, great designers, great front-end developers creating masterpieces using CSS, but you don't have to start from that point. You can start with very simple shapes like a tree, a smiley face, a house, whatever. It doesn't have to be complicated. And once you get more comfortable with creating shapes with CSS, then you can challenge yourself with more complicated designs. For example, you can go to Dribble, search for different designs, and if you see anything interesting, challenge yourself and ask yourself, how can I implement it using CSS? And then after a while, like Matrix, you can see the CSS code behind any illustrations. Like you see, okay, here's a circle, here's a transformed div here. I can use a border line here and things like that. It's really interesting. I mean, it's like doing a puzzle and painting at the same time. It's really fun. And over time, I mean, the point is, after going through all of these things, the point is, first, it's fun. Second, you learn how powerful CSS is and what are the limitations and what are the strengths. So you won't be scared next time that you're handed a very complex new design to be implemented in a website. You don't freak out, and you won't say that, okay, it's not impossible, because you've been working with lot more complex examples, a lot more complex challenges that they weren't even meant to be designed with CSS, but you did it, you implemented with CSS. So now you're not afraid of any like new type of designs that you receive. So I think, it's fun. Doing CSS illustration is fun, but over time it just makes a better front-end developer at you. So it has some impacts on your profession, so it is important. It's not a waste of time. Now let me show you some of my CSS illustrations. I'm not a pro in it, but I just do it because I like it. And it's really fun. I'm just going to show off here, but yeah, I'm saying that I'm not really pro here. So this one is called Sad Mona Lisa, and it was actually inspired from an application icon on Google Play, and the application is called Daily Art. I saw this icon, I was like, can I implement it with CSS? And there was some challenges like the eye or the teardrop. Actually, I added teardrop later because I wanted to add some sort of animation to it. It was too static. I just wanted to add some dynamic things going on. But I did it, and and I did it, and it was possible. Here's another one, and for this one, I was just looking at pictures on Dribble. I found this very beautiful design designed by this designer, and I thought maybe I should implement it using CSS. And here's another one. It's not exactly the same as the same picture from this designer, but I just got inspiration from that, and then I add these animations for the shooting star and the halo around the moon to give it some life, and so it looks like a real life scene. So basically my part is over here. Now it's your turn to share your CSS illustration with me. And I have a challenge for you. I want you to create a CSS pie like the one that I made at the very first slides, but even better one, because I know you can do better than me. Create a CSS pie, share the screenshot of the outcome and a link to whatever platform you have implemented this CSS pie on, and tweet it on Twitter. Use these two hashtags, JSworld Conference and CSS Pie Challenge. And let me see who can make a better CSS pie. So thank you guys for watching this talk. It has been a pleasure, a great experience for me. I just want to thank the JSworld people for having me today. And I want to thank my friends for pushing me all the way to this day to deliver this content in this talk, because guys, it has been really tough for a lot of us to concentrate and keep ourselves motivated during this pandemic time. And just want you to know that if you're feeling the same, it is not you. We're all having the same situation, and it's all because what is happening around. So be strong, reach out to your friends, and if you wanted to talk to me or talk about geeky stuff, you can find me on Twitter at Negar.dev. Thanks again, and hope you have a great rest of the conference.